Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing my second ever video essay, this one quite broadly about how to read and write critically. Late last year I did a course by the University of Edinburgh called How to Read, which I will link in the description, that inspired the majority of this video. It discussed the key elements of what makes a story and what plays into a story: plot, characterization, dialogue, and setting. I found that it not only helped me to read a novel analytically and to be able to recognize how these different elements come into play, but how to write and to use them in my writing. Throughout the course there were some author interviews which were very lovely, and I just made notes on everything that I thought stuck out to me, including some of my own notes and insights, which has made up this video. If you guys want me to turn this into an essay for my Substack or Medium, I would be more than happy to do that. Before I start, I want to say please make sure to like and subscribe. I've been on my grind recently. I'm going to be posting just as consistently for the next couple weeks, and then I'm going to start uni. I'm probably going to be a bit slower there just as I kind of ease into balancing social media and studying, but I do have a plan and I'm really excited to continue filming content when I'm in London. Oh yeah, I got what I needed for my uni. I got 3 A stars and an A. I just realized this is the first video I'm filming after my results. It feels like it was ages ago. Don't mind me if I'm looking to the side here. I have all of my notes, and we're gonna first start by talking about plot. A plot is different from a story, which is more so the chronological events of what happened, whereas the plot, I would say, is the how and why of things happen, the causation and the things leading up to these events. This section was split into discussing temporality and frame narratives. So temporality is the pacing of the novel, and it also includes flashbacks and flash forwards. A flashback is more formally called an analepsis, whereas a flash forward is a prolepsis. Both as a reader and a writer, you can use them quite differently. I find prolepsis is very scary because you have to balance telling the reader what's going to happen while maintaining their interest. But if you do it well, it can be an incredible tool to your story. Flashbacks usually allow us to gain some information about a character or their story, and they'll often reveal why they act a certain way in certain situations. For example, in Virginia Woolf's 1925 novel Mrs. Dalloway, which I personally DNF'd, we open with a flashback because she hears the squeaking of a door and it reminds her of something from her past. So flashbacks are very interesting. I think that some writers kind of heavy-hand the flashbacks a bit. Sometimes they're a tad unnecessary, but they can be really interesting to pique the character's interest into how a character went from point A to point B. So in Mrs. Dalloway's example, she's currently married to a politician. She's very respected. She's a member of high society, but she wasn't always like this, and she's still remembering the past quite positively. So we want to know how she got to this state. Flash forwards serve quite a different purpose. They either alter the future of a character or tell us that they can't. Without spoiling it, if you've read Harry Potter, you know what the one aim is throughout the novels. So imagine that we had started the first book with a prolepsis into the very end, and throughout the novels we're following, knowing what's going to happen at the end. That would be a very unique prolepsis. I'm trying not to spoil it, but if you've read Harry Potter, you'd know why I'm saying this. Like I mentioned, I think they can be both very interesting and also very difficult, and I think it is very important to be careful when you're writing them into your stories. If you guys have any recommendations of books that do prolepsises very well, please let me know, because again, I do find them very interesting. Just talking about the pacing of a novel in general, as both a reader and writer, you want to focus on the length of a novel and the time in which it's taking place. Some novels can dedicate entire pages or even an entire book to a moment or a day, whereas other novels or sections in a book can skip by many months or even years. I want you to think about whether a book or your book is going to pay attention to certain moments through a certain character's narration, and it might differ with another character's. For example, the first book that I ever wrote, and I haven't published it, it's very dear to me, but it took place over a week, and I actually found it quite difficult because I had to speak about every moment and I couldn't allow myself the break of just describing the way time passes in a way. Whereas the current novel that I'm writing is going to take place over a couple months, maybe even a year or two. The first book of Little Women takes place from the morning of one Christmas to the morning of another, 1 year apart, which is very symbolic and sweet to the novel. The Night Circus is an example of a book that I think the pacing of which hinders it. I thought The Night Circus was very stunning in its writing and ideas, but I ended up giving it 2 stars, mainly because of the lack of plot, but also the pacing really took me out of the novel and feeling like I was part of the characters and their lives, because instead of having one flashback in the beginning or treating certain scenes as flashbacks, there would be chapters where something happens and then the next chapter the characters would be talking about it as if it happened years later, and this was so constant throughout the novel that, like I said, I just couldn't become a part of it. So I think it's very important to be careful with the pacing of your novel, and of course when you're analysing a novel, think about why a writer is slowing down or even stopping completely at certain moments. I want to take a bit of a break now to just talk about what makes a good book, not only in terms of plot but everything else, and I want you to think about this throughout this video and the next one. I'm going to talk about 2 of my favourite books, Anna Karenina and A Series of Unfortunate Events. Though they do seem very vastly different, I actually find that they are quite similar to each other and that they both teach us about the relationship between morality, life, death, loss and love. To me, that's what makes a good book, if it has substance and it tells you something not only about the author's view of the world, but about society, history, life, or even myself. I want to finish the book being able to say the moral of the story is, even if that answer is nothing. For example, Camus or Kafka write novels wherein the intention is to present a character in a world where there is no morality or there is no purpose or law, but there's something interesting and captivating about that. Anna Karenina is a very poignant book. It's very rich in perspective, and I found that it taught me mostly about society and passion. We have a bit of a crossover here. In A Series of Unfortunate Events, the 11th book actually mentions Anna Karenina, and there's a secret code which the children must put into this system robot mechanism thing, and I memorized this very early. Lemony Snicket or Daniel Handler says that the central theme of Anna Karenina is that a rural life of moral simplicity, despite its monotony, is a preferable personal narrative to a daring life of impulsive passion which leads only to tragedy. It's a bit of a mouthful for a children's novel, but I thought it was really interesting as a kid, and I only fully understand it when I grew up and read Anna Karenina. And I think the issue of morality in A Series of Unfortunate Events is incredibly interesting because it is so open-ended, and even though the narrator kind of seems to take a side, it still doesn't make the reader push to take a side, if that makes sense. I believe Lemony Snicket, who is an actual character in the books, the narrator, seems to side with the Baudelaires, and that the moral of the story is that even if the world isn't treating you right, you should try your best to act morally. But it also presents another side, like Count Olaf's side, which is that there is no point in trying to act moral in a world that will not reward you for that morality, although he kind of breaks his own rules at the end. Or you could take someone else's side, I won't say their name because it's kind of a spoiler, which is that everyone is like a chef's salad and morality is all just mixed up in this world. It's incredibly interesting and one of my favorite aspects of A Series of Unfortunate Events. These are books that I would describe as good books, although of course a novel that has a good moral premise or idea will fall flat if it doesn't have good storytelling, pacing, and all the other elements that we're going to talk about throughout these 2 videos. An example of that kind of book, in my opinion, is The Old Man, the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. Once I finished the book and I read on Hemingway's ideas and why he won the Nobel Prize, I thought that it was interesting, but to me it didn't add any merit to the way I felt about the book, which was not great, because reading it I was completely uninterested and uncaptivated, and I didn't understand any of his messaging at all, and I really don't think that a book should require further research for it to have any kind of substance. Next, we're going to talk about framed narratives. So framed narratives are narratives wherein there's some kind of framing to the novel. We're not directly receiving the information. So A Series of Unfortunate Events is an example of that. A framed story will contain another story or several other stories within that outside structure, kind of like a series of circles where there are other circles inside. And usually in framed narratives, you will find that there are some gaps or ellipses in the plot, and those are aspects that we feel are being kept from us and are the result of either some kind of structural difficulty or with accessing the story, or just of a narrator that we don't feel we can completely trust. It's difficult for the reader to reach the actual truth because there are so many layers and prejudices kind of shadowing the story that we're being told. I think a main example of this is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Sometimes authors and as readers, you can recognize that the very physical wording of a novel kind of portrays those gaps. Like, for example, in Marlowe's novel, the page is physically full of holes because there are loads of gaps and dashes as the narrator is attempting to justify colonialism. These holes in the narrative are used to indicate to the reader that he cannot be trusted. He's skirting around the truth. In these cases where the narrator is unreliable, it might be that the narrator feels the need to explain or justify the person he's telling story. So again, coming back to Frankenstein, of course, Victor Frankenstein himself is narrating his story through prejudice. He's trying to justify why he did what he did and didn't take responsibility for it the way he should have. Of course, we can take a third point view as well, where the narrator is kind of an omniscient character who knows everything but has no personal involvement. This third person narrative does have a boundary that can really never completely be transcended. The character's voice and mind is never going to completely take over. That's also something I struggled with my first novel. I decided to write it in third person, and I'm very relieved that I decided to write in first person with my current novel, even though third person, of course, can work very wonderfully. The omniscient kind of third-person narrator is almost ventriloquizing. This technique is known as the free indirect style. It's a process of intermingling which takes place between the character and the narrator. We're going to move on now to the author interview, which took place in this section of the course, which was an interview with Alexis Wright about his novel Praiseworthy. Alexis, I think it was a woman. Alexis is a woman's name. Alexis Wright's novel Praiseworthy plays with genre bending and uses expressive, exaggerated, and even disjointed language that is sometimes difficult and repetitive, though of course it is very purposeful. One quote from the novel is, "The wind looked at the remains of life in this place, then blew and blew these fragments away in mountainous serpentine waves that hit the soul world of an even greater local spirit, and there, dust, ash, memories, written on broken butterfly wings with black soot." I actually really like the writing style there. It's really poetic, but I enjoy it. It's a blend of magical realism, of ancient Greek or Shakespearean tragedy. In this story, the characters are haunted by an intrinsic fatal flaw, which they cannot escape, and they are nearly compelled to fulfill a tragic destiny affecting all of those around them. It's a novel about Aboriginals as well, and like I said, it plays around with language. So for example, Aboriginal people use the word country to describe not only the skies, seas, waterways, and land, but also how these elements are interconnected with custom, law, language, and history to create a living cosmovision. There are two things that Alexis Wright said that stuck out to me. First, that I think we've been living in unprecedented times for a long time now through colonization and continuing colonization, and then that I wanted to try and capture the spirit of our times, where we are, where we're at, and what's plan A, what's plan B, or do we have a plan at all? So it's a book that of course has some magic and mysticism, but it is a very real aim and a very real continued issue and situation that's happening in our world. I think it's really important in novels to balance that, especially fictional novels. I think a lot of what kind of disillusions people from the current novels that we know, romance or a thriller that has no substance, it's purely there for enjoyment, or what we describe as popcorn books. Popcorn? Or is that just used to describe thrillers? I don't know if I'm going crazy. Anyway, those kind of books that don't really have too much of a purpose or point besides entertaining you and making you giddy, I think they're fun, but I think a reason why a lot of people dislike them is because they don't have substance and they don't have meaning, and even a fun book with a lot of interesting aspects and descriptions and magic can still have a purpose, I think. I've read romance books or books with romance that still have a purpose. Like in The Hunger Games, the romance plays a very important role, but the entire novel and the romance aspect is important. And Suzanne Collins manages to play around with names, for example, which are a lot of literary references. And there are novels or thrillers, like Gone Girl, which are entertaining, but they still have a lot of substance and they're clever, and I think that's what really makes a good book. Let's continue on with this. So Alexis Wright says that very early in my journey of being a novelist and writing fiction, I decided that I didn't want to be constrained. I didn't want to be constrained by some convention about how you should write a novel, or how you should write an Australian novel, or one Aboriginal person should write as fiction. We're all interlinked and interrelated and interconnected, and we all live in one world. So what happens in any part of the world happens to us too. That's a very important thing that I actually think I want to write on in more depth, and about how the one law that should really govern us all is the law to protect one another. Alexis Wright says that when they were writing this novel, they were trying to think about what impedes our desire to do something. The words kind of start to become the center of attention themselves. Their cadence, the way they sound, the materiality of the world, and I think that's something that many readers maybe don't pay attention to, but it can really affect the way that you're indulging in the novel or experiencing the novel. And I think as writers, we need to take advantage of that. Read the section of your novel out loud and think about how it feels. Alexis Wright believes that we need to be writing huge novels. We need to look at the scope of the whole, not just some little part, but then also says what I agree with, that if we do look at some little part, it can still be made into a whole or to represent a whole. I recently read a novel called Small Boat, which attempted to do that, looking at a small part and tried to have it represent the big, and while it definitely failed, in my opinion, I didn't really like that novel. I will talk about it in my August reading wrap-up. I think the idea of that is very interesting and of course should and can be used in many novels. The last quite interesting thing that Alexis Wright said was that there can sometimes be a pressure for authors that are representing marginalized communities to depict the characters as morally perfect or always upright or always driven by some kind of righteous anger. And I know this is kind of veering off just books or just writing, but I do think that it is important for us to depict and normalize that some people who are oppressed can react angrily and can react in ways that aren't perfect. And when it comes to colonization in particular, it's important to remember how colonized places in history were able to stand up and fight against it, and it wasn't always with a complete morality that fits the ideals of someone that's not being colonized. I'm actually going to stop this video there. I only got through one of the 4 sections, but I've already been filming for half an hour. This is already going to be a bit of a longer video. I didn't expect it to be this long, but I think this will actually be better. I'm giving some time and a moment for each of these little bits. I hope you guys enjoy. This is going to turn into a 4-part video, but I do hope you guys are enjoying. If you have any tips or ideas, again, if you want me to turn these into essays, then please let me know. I know this kind of branched out into different areas. I'm not just purely talking about plot and how to write a plot and how to make it interesting, but I hope all these different things that I'm talking about are helpful for both a reader who's hoping to analyze or recognize their novels in more depth, or an author who's wanting to take their novels and writing a bit more seriously. Again, I hope you guys enjoyed. Please make sure to like and subscribe if you did, and I will see you guys soon with the second part, which is characterization. I decided that I didn't want to be